Eleanor Winthrop Kane once believed her husband's silver watch had sunk to the bottom of the ocean the same night he did, 7 years ago. But at the lavish gala hosted by her own maritime empire, she spotted it gleaming on the wrist of a single father wearing a navy dress uniform. Nolan Greer was not wealthy, not famous, and had no desire to set foot inside her billion-dollar world. When Eleanor coldly demanded to know why he possessed a dead man's keepsake, Nolan simply looked at her and said, "Because your husband gave it to me before he disappeared." If you love hidden family secrets, emotional twists, and buried truths finally brought to light, hit that subscribe button right now. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Event Hall in Manhattan shimmered under a constellation of crystal chandeliers, every surface polished to mirror brightness, every table dressed in white linen and silver centerpieces shaped like ship anchors. Kane Maritime Technologies had spared nothing for this evening. A carefully orchestrated showcase designed to announce a Veterans Family Support Fund, while simultaneously unveiling a new naval technology contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The city's most powerful financiers mingled with decorated military officers, tech executives traded pleasantries with congressional staffers, and photographers circled the perimeter like gulls tracking a vessel's wake. At the center of it all stood a towering display of deep-sea rescue equipment, gleaming prototypes encased in glass, each one bearing the Kane Maritime logo in brushed titanium. The company had transformed itself in the 7 years since the death of its co-founder, Everett Kane, evolving from a respected but mid-tier maritime engineering firm into a defense technology powerhouse valued at over $12 billion. And every inch of this gala was designed to remind the world that Kane Maritime was no longer grieving but thriving. Eleanor Winthrop Kane entered through a private corridor reserved for executives, flanked by 2 assistants carrying tablets and a publicist murmuring last-minute briefing points into her ear. She wore a midnight blue gown tailored to architectural precision, her silver hair swept into an elegant knot, and her expression carried the kind of controlled stillness that media outlets had long described as regal detachment. The press called her the Iron Woman of American maritime industry, a title she neither embraced nor corrected because correcting the narrative would mean admitting that beneath the composure was a grief she had never fully processed. She had taken over the company 3 months after Everett's death at sea, inheriting a boardroom that doubted her and a grief counselor she never called back, and she had answered both with 17-hour workdays and a relentless expansion strategy that silenced every skeptic within 2 fiscal quarters. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of that transformation, a night where Eleanor could stand at the podium and speak about legacy without flinching, a night where Everett's name would be invoked as inspiration rather than wound. Nolan Greer stood near the rescue equipment display, a quiet figure in his navy dress whites among a small group of veterans and military family members who had been invited as honorary guests. He was not looking for attention and did not seek conversation beyond polite nods when someone passed by, his posture straight but relaxed, the kind of man who had learned long ago that silence was often more useful than speech. He had driven down from Norfolk, Virginia that morning, left his daughter with a trusted neighbor, and arrived at the gala with nothing more than his uniform, his military identification, and the silver watch on his left wrist. The invitation had come through a veterans outreach coordinator, and Nolan had almost declined it until he saw the name on the letterhead and realized that the universe, or perhaps something more deliberate, had finally arranged the meeting he had spent 7 years both dreading and waiting for. He did not know Eleanor personally, had never spoken to her, had never attempted to contact her through any channel, but he knew her face from the news coverage that followed Everett's death, and he knew that the watch on his wrist belonged to a story she had never been told. Eleanor moved through the crowd with practiced grace, shaking hands, exchanging brief words with investors and board members, her smile calibrated to project warmth without vulnerability. She was 3 steps from the rescue display when her gaze dropped to Nolan's left wrist, and the world around her went silent. The watch was unmistakable, a custom-made silver timepiece with a brushed face and hand-engraved Roman numerals, the kind that could not be replicated because it had been designed by a Geneva artisan who made only 12 pieces a year. But it was not the design that stopped her cold, it was the engraving she knew was on the back, 2 initials and a phrase that Everett had chosen on their 10th wedding anniversary. EC followed by the words, "The tide always returns." She had been told that the watch went down with Everett when his research vessel suffered a catastrophic equipment failure off the coast of Nova Scotia, that it was lost along with the man who wore it, sealed beneath hundreds of feet of black Atlantic water. And yet here it was, catching the light on the wrist of a stranger in a Navy uniform, as impossible and undeniable as a ghost walking through the front door. Eleanor stood frozen between the music and the chandelier light, her breath suspended somewhere between recognition and disbelief, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out colder than she intended, thin and sharp as a blade drawn across glass. "Where did you get that watch?" Nolan did not flinch. He turned to face Eleanor fully, and she could see in his eyes that he recognized her instantly, that he had known this moment would come the second he walked into the ballroom. But he did not rush to explain, did not stammer or reach for excuses the way a guilty man might. Instead, he looked at her with an expression that was difficult to categorize, something between respect and sorrow, and said quietly that the watch had been given to him by a man to whom he owed his life. Eleanor felt the answer land like a door being closed rather than opened, and in her mind, the response was not an explanation but an evasion, a careful deflection that told her nothing about how a dead man's most personal possession had ended up on a living stranger's arm. The watch was not just metal and glass to her, it was the last physical thread connecting her to a marriage that had been severed without warning, without farewell, without even the dignity of a body recovered from the sea. And seeing it on someone else's wrist felt like watching a stranger wear her husband's skin. Sterling Whittaker III materialized beside Eleanor with the fluid precision of a man who had spent decades navigating boardrooms and cocktail parties with equal ease, his silver hair combed back, his tuxedo impeccable, his hand touching Eleanor's elbow with just enough pressure to suggest guidance without command. He murmured that perhaps this matter should be handled privately, away from the cameras and the investors, that the last thing the company needed was a scene involving a mysterious military guest and the late founder's personal effects. But even as he counseled discretion, Sterling leaned closer and added with deliberate softness that men like Nolan sometimes used military credentials to gain access to grieving families, that it was not unheard of for opportunists to fabricate connections with the dead in order to extract sympathy or money from the living. Preston Maddox, the company's chief financial officer and Sterling's closest operational ally, stepped forward and signaled 2 security officers. He suggested, in a tone wrapped in corporate politeness, that Nolan accompany them to a private room for identity verification, a standard precaution for any unvetted guest in possession of company-related property. Nolan did not resist, but when Preston reached toward the watch, Nolan pulled his wrist back with a calm finality that made the security officers hesitate. He said he would go willingly, answer any question they wanted, but the watch stayed on his wrist. Then he looked past Preston directly at Eleanor and said something that lodged itself in her mind like a splinter. "I promised I would only hand it over when you were ready to hear the full truth." The statement unsettled Eleanor more than the watch itself, because for 7 years she had lived inside a narrative that was clean and closed. Everett had died suddenly in a maritime accident. The investigation had concluded with no foul play suspected. No final messages had been recovered, and no credible witnesses had come forward with alternative accounts. The story had been painful but complete, a tragedy with no loose ends, and she had built her entire second life on the foundation of that completeness. Now a stranger in a Navy uniform was suggesting that the foundation had cracks she had never been allowed to see. As Nolan was escorted from the ballroom, Eleanor turned to June Holloway, her longtime executive assistant, a woman who had been with the company since before Everett's death, and who carried herself with the quiet loyalty of someone who had chosen sides long ago. Eleanor told June to pull every file related to Everett's accident, every report, every communication log, every insurance claim, everything that had been archived or sealed in the 7 years since. But the moment Eleanor mentioned the watch, June's face changed, a flicker of something that was not surprise but recognition, as though a fear she had carried in silence had finally stepped into the light. The story of Nolan Greer did not begin in that ballroom, but in a small apartment in Norfolk, Virginia, where the rhythms of his life were defined by duty, routine, and a quiet devotion to his daughter that he rarely spoke about. After his shifts at the Naval Technical Station, he would drive home through streets lined with oak trees and chain-link fences, unlock the door to a 2-bedroom unit on the second floor of a weathered brick building, and step into a world that smelled like reheated casserole and colored pencils. His daughter was the center of his civilian life, a bright and self-sufficient child who had learned early that her father's silences were not distance but depth, and their evenings together were simple: homework at the kitchen table, dinner made from whatever was in the refrigerator, and the low hum of a radio Nolan was perpetually repairing in the corner of the living room. He mentioned her rarely to colleagues and never brought her into his professional complications, not because he was ashamed, but because he believed that a child's world should be kept separate from the weight that adults carried. Nolan had served in the Navy for over a decade, specializing in maritime technical operations and rescue coordination, the kind of work that required calm hands, precise thinking, and the ability to make decisions in darkness when the ocean was doing everything in its power to kill you. He was respected but not celebrated, competent but not ambitious, the sort of officer who would never seek a promotion he did not earn and never claim credit for a mission he did not lead. 7 years earlier, Nolan had been part of a technical rescue unit dispatched to respond to a distress signal from a private research vessel operating under contract with Kane Maritime Technologies. The night had been brutal, winds exceeding 40 knots, visibility near zero, the kind of weather that turned the Atlantic into a churning wall of black water and white noise. When Nolan's team reached the vessel, they found it listing badly, its engine room flooded, its communications array damaged beyond repair, and on that injured but conscious and clutching a waterproof case to his chest was Everett Kane. Everett was not merely a victim of mechanical failure, he was a man in the middle of something far more dangerous than a storm. He told Nolan, in fragments between waves of pain from a gash on his forearm caused by a falling equipment panel, that he had been trying to extract a data set from the company's classified internal servers, evidence that someone on the board of directors was using defense contracts to launder money through a network of shell corporations disguised as maritime consulting firms. Everett had discovered the scheme 6 months earlier, but had been unable to bring it to the board, because the people responsible were the board, and he could not bring it to Eleanor because she did not yet hold the authority to act on it without being overruled and removed. He had planned to deliver the evidence to an independent auditor, but the voyage had gone wrong. The equipment failure was too convenient, and he suspected that someone had sabotaged the vessel to prevent him from reaching shore with what he knew. In the lurching cabin of the rescue boat, with salt water streaming down the walls and the deck rolling beneath them, Everett unclasped the silver watch from his wrist and pressed it into Nolan's hand. He explained that the watch contained a micro-compartment behind the back plate, inside which was a series of encrypted codes that would unlock a hidden digital archive containing every piece of evidence he had gathered. But Everett made Nolan swear an oath that felt more like a burden than a gift. "Do not give this to Eleanor now. Do not seek her out. Do not try to be a hero. Wait until she begins to question the official story on her own. Because if she receives this before she has consolidated power within the company, the board will use her grief against her, call her emotionally compromised, strip her of her inheritance rights, and bury the truth along with his reputation." Nolan had kept that promise for 7 years, through the birth and growth of his daughter, through the death of his wife from an illness that left him a single father, through promotions he did not seek, and nights when he sat alone in his apartment staring at the watch and wondering whether loyalty to a dead man's wishes was wisdom or cowardice. He had followed the news about Kane Maritime, watched Eleanor rise from grieving widow to feared CEO, and waited for the sign that Everett had described, the moment when Eleanor's own instincts would begin to rebel against the story she had been fed. Eleanor returned to her private office after the gala ended, the noise of the evening still ringing faintly in her ears as she closed the heavy door behind her and stood alone in the silence. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk where she kept a small mahogany box that she had not touched in over a year, the box that held what remained of Everett's personal effects: his wedding ring, returned by the Coast Guard investigation team, a photograph taken on their honeymoon in the Greek islands, 3 handwritten letters he had written her during an early business trip to Singapore, and a gap where the watch should have been but never was. She had asked about the watch once, in those raw first weeks after the funeral, and Sterling had told her gently that the recovery team had been unable to locate it, that the ocean floor at that depth was effectively a vault that never opened, and that she should find peace in the things she still had rather than grieving for the things the sea had taken. She had accepted that answer because she had no energy to challenge it, because Sterling had been the steady hand that guided her through the transition, because the alternative, that the watch had not sunk at all, that someone had lied about it, opened doors she was not ready to walk through. But 7 years of running a company had changed Eleanor in ways that grief alone never could. She had developed an instinct for deception that operated below conscious thought, a sense for when numbers did not add up, when smiles lasted a fraction too long, when explanations were too smooth to be spontaneous. And now that instinct was firing on every cylinder because the image of Nolan holding the watch refused to resolve into any narrative that matched what she had been told. She sat in the dim light of her office and replayed the years since Everett's death, the boardroom battles, the strategic pivots, the late nights when she had forced herself to stop thinking about what might have been, and for the first time she allowed herself to notice the pattern she had been trained to ignore. Sterling had always been the one who told her to move forward. Sterling had always been the one who discouraged questions about the accident. Sterling had always positioned himself as the protector of her peace, when in reality he might have been the architect of her ignorance. June Holloway appeared in the doorway, carrying a folder she had retrieved from the company's archive room. Her hands were not quite steady, and when she spoke, her voice had the careful cadence of someone choosing each word as though it were a step across thin ice. June admitted that before Everett's final voyage, he had requested a private meeting with Eleanor, a meeting that had been scheduled, confirmed, and then canceled at the last moment by Sterling Whitaker, who cited unspecified security concerns. June had known about the cancellation at the time, but had been too intimidated by Sterling's authority and too uncertain of her own standing to raise the issue. And in the chaos that followed Everett's death, the detail had been buried beneath 1,000 more urgent crises. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her face perfectly still, but inside, something was shifting, a tectonic movement of understanding that rearranged the landscape of everything she thought she knew. Why had Sterling always wanted her to forget the accident? Why had Everett's final personnel file been sealed by the board rather than shared with his widow? Why had a watch reported as lost at sea turned up on the wrist of a Navy officer who claimed to have received it from Everett himself? At the end of the evening, Eleanor picked up her phone and called the security team. She told them to release Nolan Greer immediately and to arrange a private meeting with him at her office the following morning. And when she spoke to him by phone, brief and direct, she did not ask as a CEO interrogating a subordinate. She asked as a wife who had been robbed of her last goodbye. "Did my husband mention me?" Nolan arrived at Kane Maritime headquarters the next morning under a sky heavy with gray clouds that pressed against the Manhattan skyline like a ceiling slowly lowering. Sterling and Preston were already in the executive corridor, and both attempted to intercept the meeting, Sterling arguing smoothly that allowing an unvetted outsider access to the CEO's private office set a dangerous precedent, Preston adding that the company's legal team should be present for any conversation involving the late founder's personal property. Eleanor dismissed them both with a single sentence, telling them the meeting was not a corporate matter but a personal one, and that she did not require their counsel on how to grieve. The door closed behind Nolan, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other across the wide mahogany desk, two strangers connected by a dead man's last act of trust. Nolan spoke carefully but without hesitation. He told Eleanor that Everett had not abandoned her, had not hidden assets, had not lived a double life, despite what certain internal reports had subtly implied over the years. The truth was the opposite. Everett had spent the final months of his life investigating a corruption network embedded within the company he had helped build, a system in which defense contract revenues were being siphoned through fictitious consulting agreements and redirected to entities controlled by senior board members. Everett had known that exposing the scheme would require more than evidence. It would require that Eleanor hold unchallenged authority within the company, because without that authority, the board would simply vote to discredit the findings, remove Eleanor from her position, and rewrite the narrative to make Everett the villain, rather than the whistleblower. That was why he had chosen to hide the evidence inside the watch and entrust it to someone outside the system entirely. Someone with no financial ties to Kane Maritime, no ambition within its hierarchy, no vulnerability to boardroom pressure. Eleanor's reaction was a complex architecture of fury and heartbreak. She demanded to know why Nolan had not come to her sooner, why he had allowed 7 years to pass while she lived inside an incomplete story, mourning a man whose final act of love she had never been allowed to understand. Nolan answered with the truth that was hardest for her to hear. Everett had set the condition himself. The watch was only to be delivered when Eleanor began to doubt the official account on her own, not when someone else planted the doubt for her, because Everett knew that if the revelation came from the outside, the board would call it manipulation, but if it came from Eleanor's own awakening, no one could take it away from her. The answer did not bring Eleanor to forgiveness, not entirely, but it dissolved the suspicion that Nolan had kept the watch out of greed or exploitation. He had kept it out of a promise made to a dying man on a sinking ship, and the weight of that promise had shaped 7 years of his life in ways Eleanor was only beginning to comprehend. Nolan turned the watch over and carefully opened the back plate using a small tool he carried in his pocket. Inside, there were no diamonds, no hidden currency, no dramatic treasure, just a miniature engraved code sequence and, beneath it, a line that Everett had etched by hand with the patient precision of a man who knew he might not get another chance to speak. "Tell Ellie I never left." Eleanor used the code from the watch to access a digital archive that Everett had created and concealed within an obsolete server partition months before his death. The archive was meticulous, organized with the same careful logic that had defined Everett's approach to every project he touched, and its contents were devastating. There were recorded excerpts from board meetings where Sterling and Preston discussed rerouting contract payments, copies of subsidiary agreements with companies that existed only on paper, internal memos that documented how research budgets had been inflated to create slush funds, and detailed notes in Everett's handwriting identifying the exact mechanisms by which legitimate naval contracts were being exploited to generate untraceable revenue streams. Sterling Whitaker III and Preston Maddox emerged from the evidence as the two central architects of the scheme, men who had used Kane Maritime's rapid growth as cover for a financial operation that had been running for nearly a decade. What made the betrayal worse was what they had done after Everett's death. They had systematically seeded internal narratives, suggesting that Everett himself had been involved in financial irregularities, planting just enough ambiguity in company records to ensure that if anyone ever investigated, the trail would lead to a dead man who could not defend himself. Eleanor realized with a cold clarity that for 7 years she had unconsciously absorbed those insinuations, allowing a faint cloud of doubt about Everett's integrity to settle over her memory of him, a doubt that Sterling had cultivated precisely because it kept her from looking too closely at his own activities. The timing added another layer of urgency. Kane Maritime was weeks away from signing its largest contract in company history, a multi-year technology partnership with the Navy and a major sovereign investment fund. If the evidence of corruption surfaced in an uncontrolled way, the company could face debarment from federal contracting, investor panic, and the collapse of an enterprise that employed thousands of people across 6 states. Eleanor could not act on impulse, no matter how much the evidence made her want to walk into Sterling's office and end his career with a single phone call. Nolan proposed a methodical approach. Transfer the evidence to an independent forensic auditor, and simultaneously file a formal disclosure with the Defense Contract Audit Agency, following the precise legal framework that would protect the company's employees and ongoing contracts, while ensuring that the guilty parties could not destroy evidence or flee jurisdiction. Eleanor agreed. But what struck her in that moment was not the strategy itself, but the realization that Nolan thought about consequences the way Everett had, not as a calculation of personal advantage, but as a responsibility to the people who would be affected by the fallout. For the first time since the gala, Eleanor looked at Nolan not as the man who had kept her husband's watch, but as the man who had quietly guarded her husband's final wish for 7 years without asking for recognition, compensation, or even acknowledgement. At the far end of the executive floor, Preston Maddox sat at his desk monitoring access logs on the company's legacy server infrastructure, a task he performed routinely as part of what he called digital housekeeping. When the system flagged that the obsolete partition containing Everett's archive had been accessed for the first time in 7 years, Preston's face drained of color. He picked up his phone and called Sterling, and his voice, usually so controlled, carried a tremor that Sterling had never heard before. The watch came back. Sterling Whitaker III understood immediately that the threat was no longer theoretical. If Eleanor had accessed Everett's archive, then she had seen the contracts, the shell companies, the meeting recordings, all of it. His response was swift, precise, and ruthless in the way that only a man who had spent decades weaponizing information could be. Within 48 hours, carefully placed stories began appearing in financial trade publications, unnamed sources suggesting that a Navy-enlisted man with personal debts and a custody situation was attempting to leverage a stolen family heirloom to extract financial concessions from a vulnerable CEO. The stories never named Nolan directly, but they provided enough detail that anyone connected to the maritime defense community could identify him. And the implication was unmistakable. This was not a man delivering truth, but a man running a long-term confidence scheme dressed in military honor. Nolan was summoned to a formal review at his naval station, not because he had been charged with any offense, but because his name had become entangled in a media narrative that reflected poorly on the service. The review board found no evidence of wrongdoing, but the damage was done in subtler ways. Colleagues who once trusted him now regarded him with careful distance. Superiors who had respected his quiet competence now treated him with the wary politeness reserved for liabilities. His reputation, the only currency a man like Nolan had ever valued, was being eroded not by facts but by suggestion, and he bore it with the same stoic discipline that had carried him through worse nights on worse seas. Though the injustice of it settled in his chest like a stone, he could not cough free. Eleanor, reading the planted stories from the quiet of her office, felt the old habits of doubt begin to reassemble themselves. She was a woman who had survived in a world of sharks by trusting data over emotion, and Sterling knew exactly how to exploit that instinct. He appeared in her office with a posture of concerned mentorship, reminding her that Everett had always been too trusting, that his greatest weakness had been his willingness to believe in people who did not deserve it, and that she had spent 7 years proving she was stronger than that weakness. The implication was clear. Trusting Nolan was repeating Everett's mistake. But the architecture of Sterling's manipulation had one crack he had not anticipated: June Holloway. June had spent the previous night in the company's physical archive room, searching through boxes of calendars, scheduling logs, and administrative records from the year of Everett's death. What she found was a page from Sterling's personal schedule showing that on the day of Everett's last voyage, Sterling had not been in a security briefing as he had claimed for 7 years. He had been on the company's coastal facility, the same facility from which Everett's research vessel had departed that evening. The canceled meeting between Everett and Eleanor had not been a precaution. It had been an intervention, Sterling ensuring that Everett could not warn his wife before boarding a ship that was never meant to bring him back safely. June delivered the calendar page to Eleanor without commentary, and Eleanor studied it for a long time before looking up. She understood now that if she continued to doubt Nolan, Sterling would win not by proving innocence but by running out the clock, burying evidence under procedural delays and media noise until the truth became old news that no one cared to investigate. Eleanor made her decision with the same cold clarity that had built her empire. She publicly invited Nolan to attend the next board meeting as a material witness regarding the legacy and estate of Everett Kane. The invitation was formal, documented, and copied to every member of the board, making it impossible for Sterling to block without revealing his own desperation. When Sterling received the notification, he leaned back in his leather chair, straightened his cufflinks, and smiled the smile of a man who believed that every stage was his stage. He turned to Preston and said softly, "Then we will destroy him right in front of her." The boardroom occupied the entire top floor of Kane Maritime's headquarters, a cathedral of glass and steel overlooking the harbor where cargo ships and naval vessels moved in slow procession against the gray water. Eleanor sat at the head of the long conference table, Sterling to her right, Preston to her left, and 8 other board members arranged along both sides, their expressions ranging from curiosity to carefully concealed anxiety. Nolan entered in his full dress uniform, every medal in place, his bearing upright without arrogance, his face composed with the calm of a man who had already decided that the outcome mattered less than the truth. Sterling opened the questioning with prosecutorial elegance, his voice warm and reasonable as he asked why Nolan had retained property belonging to a deceased private citizen for 7 years without notifying the family. why he had chosen to reveal his possession of the watch at a public event, rather than through proper legal channels, and whether his true motivation might be financial compensation or public attention. Several board members nodded along, their skepticism reinforced by the media stories Sterling had planted, and for a moment the room felt like a tribunal rather than a corporate meeting. Nolan answered without raising his voice and without emotional appeals. He laid out the sequence of events in precise chronological order: the rescue mission, the condition of Everett's vessel, Everett's injuries, and his coherent state of mind, the transfer of the watch, the explicit instructions regarding the conditions under which it could be delivered, and his own compliance with those conditions over the intervening years. He stated clearly that he had never requested money, stock, board access, or any form of compensation from Eleanor or from the company, and he invited the board to audit his financial records, his service history, and his personal correspondence to verify that claim. Then Eleanor rose from her seat and activated a screen at the far end of the room. She played the final recorded message that Everett had embedded in his archive, a voice recording made in the weeks before his last voyage, his tone steady, but weighted with the knowledge that he might not survive what he was about to do. In the recording, Everett named Sterling and Preston directly, describing in clinical detail how they had corrupted the company's defense contracting pipeline, and he explained his decision to entrust the evidence to what he called a young sailor with eyes cleaner than this entire boardroom. The silence that followed was absolute. Sterling broke it by declaring that the recording was fabricated, that voice synthesis technology made such evidence inadmissible, that no reasonable board would accept the word of a stranger over the established leadership of a $12 billion company. But Nolan was prepared for this too. He produced a technical verification document prepared by Commander Adrian Cole, his former superior officer, confirming that the recording's timestamp, the device signature, and the GPS coordinates of the signal all matched the official mission logs from the night of Everett's rescue. The metadata could not have been fabricated without access to classified naval records that neither Nolan nor Eleanor possessed, which meant the recording was either genuine or the entire United States Navy's record-keeping system had been compromised. A possibility so absurd that even Sterling's allies on the board shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But the most devastating revelation was not the recording itself. Eleanor opened a sealed document from Everett's estate file, a governance clause embedded in his original co-founder agreement that had been overlooked during the succession process because Sterling's legal team had classified it as obsolete. The clause stated that if evidence emerged demonstrating that board members had concealed material facts about the circumstances of a founder's death, the surviving spouse held the unilateral right to invoke an emergency governance override, suspending the voting privileges and executive authority of any implicated directors pending the completion of an independent investigation. Everett had written the clause years before his death, during the early days of the company, when the partnership agreements were being drafted, and he had inserted it quietly, almost prophetically, as though he had always known that the people closest to power were the ones most likely to abuse it. Eleanor looked directly at Sterling, and when she spoke, her voice carried not the trembling fury of a wronged woman, but the measured authority of a CEO who had finally reclaimed the full truth of her own story. She said, "For 7 years you told me to let go of the past. It turns out you were just afraid the past could speak." Eleanor formally invoked the governance override clause. Sterling Whitaker III and Preston Maddox were immediately suspended from all executive functions and removed from active board participation pending the results of a forensic audit conducted by an independent firm with no prior relationship to Kane Maritime. Their access credentials were revoked before they left the building, Their personal files were secured by corporate counsel, and the accounts associated with the shell companies identified in Everett's archive were frozen through emergency judicial orders obtained that same afternoon. Sterling attempted one final maneuver in the hallway outside the boardroom, warning Eleanor that transparency would crater the company's stock price, that investors would flee, that the contracts she had spent years building would evaporate overnight. Eleanor stopped walking, turned to face him, and said that a company could survive the truth but could not survive forever on lies, that the employees who had built Kane Maritime deserved a foundation that would not collapse the moment someone asked the wrong question. It was the moment she stopped being the CEO who had inherited her husband's empire and became the leader who was willing to burn away its rot to save what was real underneath. Nolan held the watch out to Eleanor across the boardroom table after the other members had filed out in stunned silence. Eleanor looked at it for a long time, but did not take it immediately. She told Nolan that Everett had given him the watch because he trusted him, and she would not dishonor that trust by reclaiming it like a possession being returned after a loan. Nolan said quietly that his promise had been fulfilled, that the watch had served its purpose, that it no longer needed a guardian. Eleanor took the watch then, turned it over, and opened a second compartment that Nolan had never accessed, a space so small it could hold only a single folded slip of paper, thinner than a postage stamp. On it, in Everett's cramped handwriting, were the words, "Ellie, if you are reading this, it means you have lived strong enough to hear the truth. I am sorry for leaving you alone this long." Eleanor did not collapse or cry out or make any of the dramatic gestures that the moment might have warranted in a lesser story. She simply went very still, the way the ocean goes still in the moment between storms, and then she folded the paper back into its compartment and closed the watch with a soft click. After 7 years, for the first time, she whispered his name the way she used to say it at home, not Everett but the private name that belonged only to their marriage. Then she straightened her shoulders, called her legal team, and issued 3 directives in rapid succession. Begin the public audit. Clear Everett's name from every internal report that had questioned his integrity, and restore Nolan Greer's professional reputation through a formal statement from the company acknowledging his role in preserving evidence critical to corporate governance. The news broke across financial wires within hours. Everett Kane had not been a man with hidden agendas or secret accounts. He had been a founder who died trying to protect his company from the people who were supposed to protect it. Sterling Whitaker III and Preston Maddox faced federal investigation for fraud, money laundering, and obstruction, their decades of carefully constructed respectability unraveling thread by thread as forensic accountants traced the full extent of the shell company network. Eleanor received calls from major shareholders not demanding explanations but offering support, because the market, for all its coldness, recognized the difference between a CEO who hid problems and one who solved them in public. Kane Maritime's stock dipped for 3 days and then began to climb, driven by a wave of institutional confidence in Eleanor's willingness to prioritize integrity over image. Nolan did not accept the substantial financial reward that Eleanor's team offered him. He made only one request: that Kane Maritime fulfill the promise it had made at the gala, the Veterans Family Support Fund, but that it be run with full transparency, with independent oversight, and with no use as a public relations vehicle. Eleanor agreed, and she named the fund after Everett, but added a subtitle honoring the unnamed service members who had helped the truth survive when institutions had failed to protect it. It was not a grand gesture designed for cameras. It was a quiet correction of a debt that had gone unpaid for 7 years. In the final hours of a long day, Eleanor drove alone to the harbor where Everett had departed on his last voyage. The pier was empty except for the gulls and the slow rhythm of water against concrete pilings. She stood at the edge and held the watch against her chest for several minutes, feeling the weight of it, the impossible smallness of an object that had carried so much meaning across so many years. Then she turned and walked to where Nolan stood waiting beside his car, having driven down at her request without asking why. She held the watch out to him one more time. Not because it belonged to him, but because she wanted him to carry it to the fund's inauguration ceremony, as a symbol that the promise Everett had extracted from a young sailor on a sinking ship had been honored in full. Nolan took it, looked out across the harbor where the light was turning gold against the water, and said softly, "He did not disappear, ma'am. He just waited for the right person to find the truth." Eleanor smiled through tears she no longer tried to hide, no longer the CEO imprisoned by an unfinished past, but a woman who had finally heard the goodbye her husband had spent 7 years trying to deliver.